Well, now, as we move into the next king, following the death of Rehoboam, his son, a man by the name of Abijam, as we see in 1 Kings, or Abijah, as we see in 2 Chronicles, came to the throne. Now, most of the time, I'm going to call this man Abijam because to me that's easier to say than Abijah. But it's talking about the same person all along. Well, when Abijam came to the throne, Jeroboam had already been ruling for 18 years over the nation of Israel. And we find from 2 Chronicles chapter 13 and verse 2, just as we saw with Rehoboam, evidently the king's mother had a lot of influence over him. She is mentioned by name as Micaiah, and we're told that evidently that she had quite a bit of influence over the king and over his decisions. But something that I find very interesting and something that there's some disagreement upon, whenever we look at what the scriptures tell us about, like I said, 1 Kings she's called Micah, 2 Chronicles she's referred to as Micaiah. Once again, I find Micaiah easier to pronounce. So that's how I'm going to refer to her. But we are told that she was the granddaughter of Abijam, also known as Absalom. Now, where the books of Kings and Chronicles often get very confusing is when we see individuals going by more than one name, where we see individuals or multiple individuals going by the same name, or whenever we see familiar names being worn by unfamiliar people. So whenever we think about Micaiah, who was the wife of Rehoboam, we're told that she was his most beloved wife, the mother of Abijam. We're told that she was descended from Absalom. Now there's two different ideas that are promoted here. There are some who argue that David was Abijam's great-grandfather on both his mother and father's side. On his father's side, he would have descended from David through Solomon to Rehoboam. And then on his mother's side, he would have descended from David to Absalom, then to Absalom's daughter Tamar, who ironically had the same name as Absalom's sister. You see where it gets somewhat confusing. But then there is another view that Absalom being referred to here, or Abijam, as we see in 1 Kings, that this is a completely different person altogether. That this is not Absalom, the son of David, being referred to. It was simply another person with the same name. But regardless of the lineage, that's not what's really important about this. What we find is that Micaiah, regardless of her lineage, she was Rehoboam's most beloved wife. We're told in 2 Chronicles 11:21 that Rehoboam had 18 wives and 60 concubines. A little bit better than Solomon, but not much. 18 wives, 60 concubines, but he had a favorite. Micaiah was the favorite. And Abijam, the son of his favorite wife, was the one who had been handpicked to succeed him on the throne. But 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 3 tells us that Abijam wasn't any better than his father. Tells us that he walked in all the sins of his father, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord God, unlike the heart of David, his great-grandfather. We're told that Abijam's sin was that he forsook the law of God. He did not keep the law, and therefore, whenever he rose to power, he led that nation down an even further destructive path, led them even farther away from God. But we find that even though we now have two generations of unfaithfulness, Rehoboam was unfaithful, Abijam was unfaithful, we find that God continues to allow the lineage of David to sit upon the throne of Judah. The reason for this is because of a promise that was made to Solomon. that for David's sake, that there would always be someone of that lineage seated upon the throne of Judah. Well, now, as we come back to the little bit that's recorded about Abijam, we find that when Abijam rose to the throne, tensions had already risen between Judah and Israel. The peace that had existed had fallen, and now they were on the brink of a full-scale war taking place. Well, Rehoboam had not done anything whatsoever to try to settle this, to try to bring peace to the two nations. And the book of 1 Kings really tells us very little about the reign of Abijam, other than the fact that his entire reign was marked by war with Israel. But as we'll see in just a few moments, the account of his reign in 2 Chronicles tells us a little bit more about what happened during his reign. Well, Abijam would reign for only 3 years. And during that short 3-year period, a lot of things happened that would continue this downward spiral of this nation. But when Abijam died, he was buried in Jerusalem along with his ancestors. And we're told that his son, a man by the name of Asa, rose to the throne, succeeding him. But now, let's turn over to 2 Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles chapter 13, we find the one event that is recorded from the life and the reign of Abijam. We're told that not long after he rose to the throne, there was a major battle that ensued between Judah and Israel. Both of these nations, they prepared themselves for battle. This war was going to take place on the mountains of Ephraim, which was on the border between these two kingdoms. Judah went into battle with 400,000 soldiers. Israel went into battle with 800,000 soldiers. But we find something that, in my opinion, is very interesting. We find that before the battle actually takes place, Abijam, he goes and he stands upon Mount Zemaraim, and he calls out to the army of Israel. And this speech is one that I believe has a very important message. And he begins by reminding Jeroboam and the people of Israel of the fact that God had made a covenant with David and with David's descendants, that they would be the ones who would reign over that kingdom. But Jeroboam, and I love the terminology that he uses, but Jeroboam and those worthless rogues, Jeroboam and the worthless rogues came and followed him. They strengthened themselves against Rehoboam while he was still young, inexperienced, and unable to stand against their forces. So Abijam, he starts out, he says, you know what, folks? You really need to be serving me. I'm the rightful king. I'm the descendant of David. The covenant was made with David. And after all, you're just a bunch of worthless folks, because here you had Rehoboam. He was still young. He was still inexperienced. And you would not give him a chance. You went along with this scoundrel. You went along with this rogue, Jeroboam. You divided the nation. Well, he then goes on and talks about the fact that they now felt like they were able to even stand against the one true God. Well, folks, what's already taking place in Judah at this point? Are they serving the one true God? No. Idolatry is running just as rampant in Judah as it is in Israel at this point. But yet, Abijam, he believes that since he is of this rightful lineage, that God is on their side. And that anyone that goes up against Judah is going up against God. And it talks about the fact that they had even brought their idols out to the battlefield. It talks about the fact that Jeroboam had run the priests out of Israel and had brought in false priests to serve the false gods. But then, something that's so ironic to me, he then makes the claim that Judah had not forsaken God. Now tell me this. If they had built temples to all of these false gods, if Rehoboam and now Abijam have continued the idolatrous practices that began under Solomon, how could he stand there and make the claim that they had not rejected God? How could he make the claim that they were in any better position spiritually than Israel was at this point? I don't see how he could make that claim. But he says the reason why they believed that was because the descendants of Aaron were still active in offering sacrifices both morning and evening. Yeah, those sacrifices were still taking place, but sacrifices were also being made to false gods. People were still practicing other forms of worship to false gods as well. So even though that was still taking place, even though these priests, the descendants of Aaron, were continuing in their daily practices, that doesn't mean anything when it comes down to the fact that they had all of these other practices going on. And so Abijam, he concluded that God was on their side. That God was going to support them, and that any nation that would rise up against Judah was not just rising up against that nation, they were rising up against the Lord God Himself. Now, he also believed that it would be an exercise in futility for Jeroboam and his forces to wage this war. Well, folks, in my opinion, and the script and the passage doesn't tell us this, but I think it's a good deducement from what we see. Jeroboam's not putting any stock in this speech whatsoever. Jeroboam knows what's going on in Judah. Jeroboam knows that what Abijam is saying is not the truth, that it's not sincere. And so, while Abijam is standing up on this mountain, giving this grand speech, trying to intimidate Israel, Jeroboam takes some of his army and surrounds those of Judah, surrounds the Judean army. He believed that an ambush had been set, and it really had. I mean, he had twice as many soldiers than what Judah had. They were outnumbered. They were now surrounded. But what happened next is really telling. Notice up until what we read in 2 Chronicles 13, 14, and 15, nothing tells us that God was on the side of Judah. Nothing tells us that God had ever authorized war to take place between these two nations. But yet, whenever the people saw that they were surrounded, the Judeans, when they saw they were surrounded, they began to cry out to the Lord for help. They understood the helpless nature of their situation, and they rightfully began to cry out to God. Well, it says, then the priests sounded their trumpets, and the men of Israel began to shout. Well, when this happened, God struck Jeroboam and all of Israel before Abijam and Judah. Folks, I wholeheartedly believe that if the army of Judah had not cried out to the Lord for help, this would have been a massacre on this day. God was not on their side at this point. But when they truly humbled themselves and cried out to God for help, that's when God came to their aid. Now, the Scriptures do not tell us exactly how God struck the army of Israel, but we find that 500,000 of Israel's 800,000 soldiers were killed. How that happened, well, like I said, we don't know. But 500,000 soldiers were killed when God struck that army. This greatly weakened their defenses. They fled in fear, and we're told that Abijam was able to conquer several cities that up to this point had been the possession of Israel. Among those were Bethel, Jeshanah, and Ephraim, as well as several other surrounding villages. But I want you to notice what 2 Chronicles 13:8 tells us. It says that the reason this victory was able to be had, the reason why Judah was able to be so successful in this battle, was because they relied on the God of their fathers. Why didn't they cry out to one of their false gods? Why didn't they rely on their own strength? Why didn't they depend upon the strength of their leader? Folks, it's because deep down they knew who the one true God is. They knew where to turn, but they had been led astray. They had been led into practicing many things contrary to the will of God. But because they relied upon God, because they cried out to God, asking for His protection and His guidance, they received it. Well, also, we find that this one event also brought about the downfall of Jeroboam as king over Israel. Jeroboam had been a very popular king. He had reigned for many years at this point. But we're told, and most people believe, that when God struck the army of Israel, that Jeroboam was struck with some type of illness. We're not able to state that with 100% certainty, but we do know that shortly after this took place, 2 Chronicles 13 and verse 20 tells us that the Lord struck Jeroboam and he died. And so, one way or the other, whether it was directly involved in the strike that came against the Israelite army, or whether this was something that happened shortly thereafter, we don't know. But we find that Jeroboam's reign came to an end as a result of what happened on that day. But during the 3 short years that Abijam was the king of Judah, we find that 2 Chronicles 13 and verse 20 tells us that he was quite prolific. He grew in strength. We're told that he had 14 wives, 22 sons, and 16 daughters. The context there seems to imply that all of this took place during the 3 years that he was king. But also an interesting statement is made at the end of the Chronicles account about the reign of Abijam. And if you notice there in verse 22 of 2 Chronicles 13, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Abijah, his ways and his sayings, are written in the annals of the prophet Iddo." A similar statement is found in 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 7, where it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Abijam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah?" Now there are 2 suppositions about these 2 passages. Some say that there are 2 different books in reference here. Others say that it's speaking of the same book. Well, those who hold to the view that this is referring to the same book, what they say is that this is referring in each of these passages to a non-inspired work of history. A work that would have been chronicled by a man by the name of Iddo that essentially has been lost to history because it was not inspired of God. Others believe that there are 2 books in referenced here, or being referenced here. The belief is that the 1 Kings chapter 15 statement is referring to what would then be recorded in the book of 2 Chronicles. But then the statement in 2 Chronicles about the book of Iddo is talking about a separate, non-inspired work. From what I see in the context, I tend to believe that this is talking about 2 separate works. I don't think that this is talking about just one book. I believe that what we find throughout the book of 1 Kings, we find reference after reference to things that were written in the book of the Chronicles, things that were detailed more so in this other work. But this book of Iddo is one that we really don't see many references to. There's not really anything in the historical record that would lead us to believe that this was intended to be an inspired book that was to be preserved. And so with that in mind, most people believe that the majority of the things that took place in the reign of Abijam, the things that were chronicled by this man Iddo, have been lost to history. But what we do know about Abijam is he was a sinful man. He was a sinful man who God used to preserve the nation of Judah during a time of war with Israel. So let's look at a couple of applications that we can see from the life of Abijam or Abijah. Well, folks, the thing that I see set forth the most in the accounts that we find of this man are the importance of trusting in God. The first, folks, our trust in God is tested during challenging times. We stop and we look at what was taking place when they were on the battlefield. Abijam was outnumbered 2-1. But Abijam and Judah's army, they trusted in God to deliver them. They cried out to God, asking for His protection and His guidance. And as a result of them humbling themselves and asking God to be with them, they were able to defeat the Israelites, even facing such overwhelming odds. Well, folks, when we face challenging times, when we face times of fear, when we don't know what to do, it's important that we keep our trust in God. When we don't know where to turn, when we don't know what to do, we can always turn to God. And we know that if we will follow God's will, that He will always guide us down the right paths. But secondly, we find that our trust in God is also tested during times when we're strong. Putting that in another way, our faith in God is tested both in the good times and the bad, in the strong times and in the weak. While Abijam trusted God in the face of overwhelming odds when he was weak, we find that did not continue when he was strong. When the times got hard, he wanted God on his side. But when the times were going good, when he was strong and mighty and things were going well, that trust in God was not there. He trusted in his own strength, in his own might, in his own ability to lead. And I think that we all can understand somewhat where he's coming from. Because when things are going good, when everything seems to be positive and pleasant and blessed, a lot of times we have the tendency to lose sight of where those blessings are coming from. We have the tendency to focus upon our own abilities and our own strength, rather than focusing upon the fact that those blessings are coming from God. This was what we saw with Abijam. Remember, Paul warned Christians in 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 through 19, that we don't need to trust in financial strength. We don't need to trust in physical strength. We don't need to trust in the things of this world, but we need to constantly trust in God. And then you remember, and I'll leave you with this, in Revelation chapter 3, verses 14 through 22, when Jesus is sending this message to the church at Laodicea, they're rebuked because they were trusting in their own strength rather than trusting in God. That was the downfall of Abijam. So we're going to stop there for this week. And Lord willing, next Wednesday night we'll pick up with Jeroboam.